This figure is an example of a market without external costs. It's a very standard supply and demand curve, and the market curve reflects the private cost producers must pay to manufacturers for each kilowatt of electricity. The market price will then be the equilibrium point E, right? We've already talked about this in previous materials, and the supply curve is based on these private costs crosses the demand curve. In a hypothetical situation, the curves intersect at the market price and with an output of a certain kilowatt hours. And so basically, again, this works very similar to the supply and demand curves that we've talked about already. This slide represents market when we include external costs as well as private costs. And notice that the supply curve, as it moves up, the equilibrium point moves down such that the kilowatt hours and the price point per kilowatt hour is different than it would be under the normal equilibrium curve. And so what this basically argues is that the electricity is underpriced and overproduced. So we are charging less than we should, and we are producing more than we should. And so when we pass on those costs, the price will go up, but it more fully reflects all of our costs at the end of the day. It means that basically what this means is from the consumer's perspective, I'm going to pay a little more money when I am charging that, and that is a better situation. So what we want is better utility. When we are not taking into external costs, we're not maximizing our utility at the end of the day. So let's look at the approaches to internalizing the external costs of pollution. If a company internalizes those external costs of pollution, they are obligated to clean up the environment and install pollution controlling devices. And the goal should be we want to remedy any negative impacts on the environment. So we take on the cost for polluting control, et cetera, et cetera. And that decreases the costs, that's a one-time investment to decrease costs across the board. How might external costs of pollution be internalized? By imposing the costs on the polluting agent and installing pollution controlling devices in that sense of it. In terms of remedies and justice, internalizing costs is consistent with the requirements of distributive justice. What is fair? We take on responsibility for the things. We don't put a burden on others, and we make sure that there's fair outcomes for everybody involved. In terms of costs and benefits of the remedies, what are some of the costs and benefits of the remedies? Well, pollution technology is very effective, but it's costly. So there's no doubt about it that they are expensive, but they are very, very effective. So there's a very high first-time cost to enter to get that, involved in your system, and then the costs of ultimately on technology will go down, right? It's just when you're a first mover, that's what it costs. A cost-benefit analysis for pollution control works towards equilibrium where the cost of pollution control equals its benefits. And that's really the goal. So when we do the cost-benefit analysis, the goal is to move towards that equilibrium point where, it costs us a certain amount of money, but we make good money by doing what we need to do right. The utilitarian cost-benefit analysis assumes that measurement is, of course, possible, and it's not always possible. So at least from a utilitarian perspective, the goal is that we want to be able to have maximizing benefits, reducing the opportunity costs, and ultimately finding that the equilibrium for investing in pollution control. And an alternative solution though is that outright ban that we talked about. And certainly the rights theory, the moral rights theory would argue that that's the right thing to do. The just outcome would be if we don't ban it, it is going to continue to have a negative impact on people. So we don't want to have a negative impact on people. So from a rights perspective and from a justice perspective, that would be the other alternative. So the goal is to obviously explore alternative measures and then figure out a way to make sure that your costs and benefits work out. This slide just illustrates what we talked about in the previous slide about finding that equilibrium point between the benefits of removing the pollution and the cost of removing the pollution. But we also have to take into account, community outrage, reputation, and things like that. That's harder to quantify, but it's definitely an issue. Again, if you look at, Ford Pinto, and they didn't take into account in their cost-benefit analysis public outrage at what happens when they do what they do, creating that issue. So our goal is to account for as much as we can quantitatively, but also make an allowance for things that are not measurable, like reputational issues and things like that, to figure out where that cost benefit point is. So let's talk about social ecology, ecofeminism, and the demands of caring. And this goes back to care, the ethics of care. We've talked about utilitarianism, we've talked about universalism, we've talked about the justice and the virtue ethics in different ways of thinking about, environmentalism and making sure that we are dealing with ecology and the remedies and the cost to remedy all sorts of different issues. So social ecology is until patterns of hierarchy and domination are changed, we will be unable to deal with environmental crises. And so this argues that we need to make changes in the way that we go about doing business and we go about the way that we handle our environment. And so we can't deal with these environmental crises until we deal with the social structure and the infrastructure that's in place in terms of the way that we interact with each other societally. Ecofeminism argues that the root of our ecological crisis results in a pattern of domination which likens the way women have been dominated and subordinated to men over the centuries. Okay, it's not a perspective that I take, but I have no problem following it and understanding it if you buy into this idea, the social practices and institutions that subordinate women to men. The environment is just another thing that has been subordinated. And I can understand that. Do I think that's the only solution to the problem? No, but it makes some degree of sense. Certainly there are people that believe that we have dominion over, if you look at Bible verses and Bible quotes, we have dominion over our environment. And it depends on how you interpret the word dominion, right? For some people, dominion means I control it. It answers to me. And for others, dominion means we need to care for it. I think about my own faith tradition and how we value the notion of caring for our environment. We believe dominion means it's our responsibility to care for it. Very different perspective than arguing that we are there to control it. Lastly is, of course, care ethics, and the notion of that the destruction of nature is accompanied by this notion of domination that has to be replaced with caring and nurturing a perspective. And again, that aligns with ecofeminism, right? The goal that, instead of feeling like we have to dominate or control it, or that it's there for our taking, it is about us caring for that environment and recognizing the interdependence we all have, with the environment. Lastly, we'll talk about the ethics of conserving resources, not just sort of stewardship, but how do we conserve them? How do we care for them? And so we'll start with evaluating the ethics related to conservation. And really it comes down to the ethics of caring, right? That we should ration for future generations, as I said earlier, right? And some Native American cultures believe that we should think about 7 generations forward, what impact our behaviors and thoughts and actions will have on future generations. And so the goal is that we should ration for future use, or to be good stewards now so that we have a less of a detrimental impact in the future. And sort of conservation ethics is why and how much we should conserve. So if you argue conserving, there are still debates as to, so what should we do and how much should be done. And then conservation ethics is concerned with the destruction and depletion also of natural resources. So it's also concerned with the destroying, of the Amazon rainforest. It's concerned with the, water supplies being disappearing, et cetera, and how we have to care for that. There are some that argue that the future generations don't have a right to natural resources. I don't know why anybody would believe that. It's certainly not an agreement that I subscribe to, but the argument is, well, they don't exist, so they don't have rights. Well, they will exist because that's how it works in our society, right? We procreate, we have generations that follow us, and even if I'm personally choosing not to procreate, it doesn't mean that others aren't, and we have this interdependence that we need to pay attention to. And the other argument is, well, just because they may be present, they may not, let me try that one more time. I'm tired, as you can tell. They may not put present generations at risk. So even if we care about the future generations, they don't have the right to put us at risk. Now, I don't necessarily believe that we are being put at risk. That's a very sort of slippery slope argument. I think there's nothing wrong with arguing that we need to care for the environment. It'd be one thing if it's the choice between surviving now or surviving later. Well, that's a very different story than saying, if I'm just not going to care for the environment now and I don't care what happens in the future. If it's life or death for me, of course I'm going to do whatever it takes because I want to survive, even if it may have a negative impact on the environment. And so I don't necessarily buy into this notion that present generations are putting us at risk. I think it's asking us to just take better care and to not do harm if we can avoid it. And the last argument is, it makes no sense to protect the interests about whom we know nothing. If we don't know what their interests are, we can't protect them. And again, I find this to be sort of a lazy approach to things. That means I only care about me and I only care about myself. And that's not an argument that I personally subscribe to. I can see how others would, it doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but I do understand, right, that the notion here is that they're arguing, since we don't know who they are, we shouldn't care about them at all from that perspective. But really what it comes down to is justice. And Rawls' position on this is that there are heavy burdens on the present generations, disproportionately heavy burdens on present generations is unjust. That the disregard for future generations is also unjust. So there is a balancing point here, right? That yes, we don't want it to be a heavy burden on us such that it limits our ability to survive and thrive. But there's a difference between surviving and thriving and having excess. And that kind of gets into the virtue ethics, right? In Aristotle's point of view of what is excess and what is the appropriate golden mean of behavior. And I think that's what we're looking for here. We're looking for the golden mean. We're looking for that sweet spot in the middle that's not too excessive and not too unjust in either directions. The justice demands that we really make sure that we leave the next generation no worse off than we are now. So we should not make things worse. If we can make them better without creating harm for ourselves, that would be great. But we certainly don't want to leave the future any worse off, because one extreme or the other, of course, is not fair. Other arguments, right, suggest a very similar view. The idea of leaving our children a world no worse than what we received, leaving the world as productive as we found it, sustainability arguments that we do not deplete renewable resources faster than they're replaced, and not deplete renewable resources faster than we find replacements, non-renewable resources, than we can find replacements. And again, those are some of those other arguments, the sustainability arguments and care ethics and things like that. Ultimately, Ultimately, our goal is economic growth and environmental ethics, and we really need to figure out how do we grow sustainably without draining resources. So E.F. Schumacher says that the industrialized nations will have to convert from growth-oriented, capitalistic-intensive technologies to a labor-intensive technology in which humans do work that machines do now. So it's asking for us to slow down our economic growth. And I'm not sure that I agree with that, but that might be one perspective on it. Others argue for a scale down that preserves a desired state of wealth. That's something much more I could buy into, right? We don't need to have unfettered growth, but we don't need to have, no growth either. We need to have, again, that equilibrium point in the middle, enough for us to survive and thrive, and to make that work. So those are all the arguments. They all cover the range of, virtue ethics, care, ethics of care, justice and Rawls justice work. It covers other aspects. And the most important thing is recognizing, as we look at these situations, recognizing where the notion of utility comes into play, where the notion of universal moral rights comes into play, as we're making decisions about how we handle our environment.